This is the January 16th, 2025 meeting of the Blue Ribbon Housing Committee. We'll quickly do the roll call. Byron? Here. Andrew? Here. Tracy?
Here.
Counselor Moreau?
Here.
And Jen?
Here.
Mary?
Here.
John? Here. Eric? Here. And Megan Corsetti cannot join us tonight, and Dagan.
He's on the
He's
call.
on Zoom behind you.
Jagan, can you?
Hello, I'm here.
Oh, it's on here.
Excuse me, one other person.
Joanna? Joanna is
Mhm.
not here. We have planning board, so I'm gonna. Here. Housing Opportunity Planning Grant. I think you saw the document. Peter, any comment on that?
No, the only comment, I guess, is that you saw that the tasks laid out in there, and if you have questions about the project, you can ask us, but the contract has been signed by the city and is with New Hampshire Housing now, so we're waiting. Once we get that back, we can get started.
Great.
Consultant's ready to go. He's reached out and said whenever you guys want to start, so,
Okay.
yeah, RKG, yep.
And that will springboard us into zoning changes.
Yeah.
And, when do we think something might come our way to look at?
That's a good question. I guess we got.
Yeah, I think he'll probably take a few weeks to get an initial analysis and then have the first public outreach.
Should the housing committee meet with him prior to the first outreach to help brainstorm what that outreach might look like?
We have to arrange that. We could do that. It'd have to be a Zoom meeting maybe or something. So we don't add travel time to his budget.
Right. Well, I'm thinking there's a lot of knowledge in this room of some of the
Yep.
changes.
Sure. Yeah, we can set that up.
Any other comment or questions on the Housing Opportunity Planning? Grant? It was nice to receive that. I went over to Concord and got our plaque. And interesting look at what other cities and towns around the state are doing. Good talk with Ryan Pope from Dover about their transfer of development rights and how that's working for them. We can maybe talk about that in the future. Workforce Housing Trust Fund. As you know, we had that document before us. Peter, you want to give us the latest on that?
So that is something that we had thought was more straightforward, and it looks like there's going to be a few more details in terms of the legal department. They've looked at it. They talked with the chair of the trustees of trusts, and he has some things he wants them to add in from a legal standpoint. So that will be coming.
Yeah, hopefully the next meeting we'll have that.
Hopefully, I don't think it's huge,
Yeah.
but it's just some things that needed to be added. So it wasn't ready for this meeting.
Right.
Now, what's the process with this?
I think once we get it in place, then you'll be ready to go if you, in terms of receiving money and raising money, and you'll have a place for that money to go. If there's money that comes in advance of that, it could be put into an escrow account on hold to go to that. So I think there is a ability to deal with money if it's received in advance of that, but
Is there any prospect for any funding in advance of the, document being?
there is, I don't know how much we want to say about that right now. But there's a
It's in the
potential.
settlement agreement.
Yeah.
It's what's public in the settlement agreement, so.
So there's a settlement agreement. Where
So,
there's,
right, the settlement agreement that was put out there, the settlement agreement with Kane actually had payments into the housing trust when that's all settled. We just don't know timeframe.
And also, it bookend to.
Right.
Put money in. That could be used to purchase land, that could be used for rental assistance, that could be used for assisting developers to put permanently below market units in variety of purposes. As a Texan I knew once said, money is just a force to do things. So. but that document should come back to us. And what, couple weeks in time for our thing.
That's the hope.
That's the hope.
When it gets into legal,
Right.
they drive
Sometimes,
the bus.
sometimes things get held up in legal, but I didn't anticipate that. I think they're clear on what they need to do. It's just they couldn't do it before this week.
Thank you.
Other questions or comment on that?
One
So,
question,
yes,
if there is any funding for this, would this committee or how would it go of a recommendation for those monies to be spent?
Isn't it the trustees of the trust who have ultimate decision-making over that money?
Well, they get to decide where it gets spent, but the recommendation would come from this committee and ultimately the council. So this council would recommend this committee would recommend to the council the way it's structured now, and I believe that'll stay the same. But the trustees of the trust oversee the funds to make sure that the process is followed that way.
So even the action by the council is a recommendation.
the trustees of trust funds release the money on the vote of the council.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the end point.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just unsure what you were saying.
Yeah, the council has the authority to release the money or to tell the trustees to release the money.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
But that's not what I understood.
Oh,
Thank you.
sorry. Yep.
No, that's fine.
So I think that's a future topic is what would we do if we had that liquidity? What could we do for housing purposes?
Mhm.
Could be low interest loan. Any number.
Well, I think that, and are there any guidelines established or is it wide open? The reason I'm asking is, for instance, I'll just pick up on what John said, the low interest loans. Is there a vehicle there to protect the repayment of those low interest loans? Is there a lien on the property?
I can speak to that a little bit. So, for example, the Portsmouth Community Hometown Buyer Program.
Yeah.
Which we issue now.
Yeah.
Is the down payment assistance. And yes, there is a second mortgage, and yes, it is.
Yeah,
forced-
I know that on that.
Forced
program.
repayment. So using that same structure and body, I feel as though once you have the guidelines, you can then associate whatever the parameter is to receive the money into that property. So, whether it's a threshold of affordable housing, maybe it's a public involvement, public community improvement stipulation. I think all of those things could be very easily tracked and measured or quantified.
Yeah, and I agree with you completely.
Yeah.
In fact, is, so that's what I was asking is, I know that there is, as you say, in the hometown program, basically if you quoted with the deed. Ads, and I was just questioning whether a similar vehicle would be in place. with
That's
the-
a separate program.
I know it,
And
I
and
know it-
administered differently. So the rules in the trust would dictate how the money would be watched
That's
over.
what-
So,
and-
and the money in the trust could establish potentially a lien or a situation to get the money built back into the trust if that was the plan for those funds. It would have to be on a case by case basis.
Okay, so what I'm asking is, and, I agree with what Andrew said, because, I've been involved with it since day one. But the other part of it is, I'm asking, are there guidelines with regards to this program and money given for down payments and that type of thing? And what I'm hearing is that there are no guidelines, it will be handled on a case by case basis.
Yeah, I don't think, I think you guys can clarify in the trust, but that's not the purpose of this trust. It's to provide, the same, it's not an overlap with that program, I guess,
No.
is my understanding and what you talked about and what you wanted in the trust. It wasn't to do the same thing that the hometown program does. It's a separate
Yeah.
pool of money to do, to provide below market rate housing is the goal here.
Yeah.
So if that means putting a lien on something and that works out to that, then I suppose you could do that, but that's
Okay,
not how it's anticipated.
And I think of it the same way. And so if you look at the city of Dover, they have impact fees and as I'm taking it from their sheet, their enabling legislation forces them to have a purpose of that money where it is contributed. And then they clearly list out the purposes of these. Now, the purposes are rather big and large in scope, which I think is very intentional. And I think we could have the same, and much like a conditional use permit in the city, when looking at the criteria or when looking at a specific project or application, okay, we can see where this is going, and is it quantifiable? Is it measurable? Maybe it has to check off 2 of 3 or 3 of 3 things before you are administering that money. But even so, like the purpose, that box of having a purpose to it should be set out initially. And then when somebody comes in, how many of those are they checking off now allows us to make that really clear decision. So it's not a big.
I would submit that we should develop a hierarchy of uses for this.
Entirely, yeah. And so, for example, their purpose of the fees promote the public health, safety, convenience, welfare, and prosperity, ensure that adequate and appropriate public facilities are available, provide for the harmonious development of the city and its environment. So that's not very specific, and I think it's great. Because now you can collect as much of the application as possible, and then funnel it down to be more specific to, okay, is this a Sherburne Sewell style development, or is it something in the middle of downtown? What is most relevant to that application that we feel as though we can justify with that applicant?
Other questions or comments on that? On the Workforce Housing Trust Fund? If not, we'll move on to the payment in lieu. If you read the packet, this anticipates a vote on this for us tonight. Are there any? I would consider suspending the rules if there's any public commenters who want to comment on payments in lieu. Is there?
If I could just mention, I'm
Should we
John
motion to suspend the rules?
Yeah.
Did you ask for public comment?
We need a motion of the committee to vote to do
Move to
that.
suspend the rules without public comment.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Now we can have public comment. Former Counselor Hudo raised her hand, and
I'm John Logan.
John, yes, good to
You've
see
seen me
you.
before.
Yes.
And,
Would you,
so this is possibly an interesting topic, but when I learned about the meeting tonight, I was unable to find an agenda, and I have no idea what payment in lieu is about. There's probably some backup material that has been distributed to somebody, but I couldn't find it on the webpage. So I don't know how you would expect a member of the public to be able to comment on this topic if they didn't know what you're talking about. And that's a general comment that I wanted to make tonight, that I don't know what the housing committee is doing, what the housing committee is up to. You're having a meeting and there's things on your agendas, but I have no idea. I didn't even know what the agenda was, much less what the content of these agenda items was. Is there something that I'm missing? Because I'm usually able to find things.
yes, all of the meetings have agendas posted 24 hours in
I saw
advance.
that, but where's the agenda?
Agenda meeting packet. If you go to the meeting packet, that has the agenda plus all the
Oh, then
additional.
there was a meeting. packet.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so I missed it.
Now you know.
Well, thank you. Well, I have to ask, thank you.
Okay. Former Counselor Hudo.
Can I speak from here? or-
Yes.
Um,
So, I did find the packet and I went through the, policy considerations that the staff had recommended. So I'm kind of struggling to see the benefit of this program. So in paragraph 3, basically the planning board acknowledges that this does not get the city any income controlled housing or meet the inclusion standard. If you read paragraph 3, as a taxpayer, I urge you to ask yourself if this committee will be creating the same situation as before with the community space. Now, if we remember, I don't know for how many years, 6, 8 years, they had a choice. as a developer to either give us community space or give us workforce housing. We had one or maybe two developers in that period of time that actually took that other incentive to give workforce housing. And as I recall, I guess, directive from the mayor originally to this committee was to figure out a way to get workforce housing instead of them taking giving the community space. I guess the first suggestion, if you do move forward on this, would be also, I think, suggested by the staff, would be to heed the suggestion of the staff by requiring full payment of the cost to produce a unit. So if you're going to produce a unit for yourself to sell or rent at market rate, why wouldn't the cost be the same if you were going to give money in lieu and put it into your fund for that unit? The next thing I would urge this committee to think about, if you do a cost benefit analysis over time, it would show that the developer can increase the market rate substantially. Thus, the developer gets an increased profit and the city still has does not have an increased supply of affordable housing. So that is some analysis that this committee, I think, needs the data to look at. The other thing that I did, I'm an analyst, so I had to do this. I went through and I summarized the project noted in Mr. Britt's article in the Herald. And it shows the zoning changes that were made by the council, and it looks forward to 2025 and after that. And the number of so-called affordable or workforce house units is surprising moving forward. The units that are going to come online or be constructed in the next couple of years that are at market rate, that have not taken any incentive to do workforce housing, according to my calculations, after looking at and adding up all of the projects that were in there, it was 93% of the projects moving forward be offered at market rate only. And 7% would be at affordable rates. That 7% also includes 44 units that are down at 1035 Lafayette with PHA in the church. Now, we all know that that is kind of on hold until the deed restrictions get released. So we don't really have a start date on that. Looking at it from that perspective, you would have, 96% market rate and 4% affordable housing. So the history of developer incentives like this doesn't seem to be getting us where we want to go. So I would question how allowing a developer to pay this small amount and not build more affordable housing is going to change the results of what we have now. So just something for the committee to think about. I would also ask maybe if for you to have the data to look at of where these projects are and what is moving forward, if you could ask staff to prepare you the same analysis that I did. I could go out and I could read you the projects, but I think this committee needs the data to look at this before you move forward. I guess the last thing that became perfectly clear with the beginning of this meeting was why this is coming forward. And from my perspective as a taxpayer, I do not see the benefit of this, of putting money in here for filling the immediate need of what was trying to be accomplished by this committee. And that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Okay. Any other comment on that? If not, maybe we can get,
Can I just clarify a couple things?
absolutely.
That the recently approved zoning amendments that incorporated the Gateway Neighborhood Overlay District outlined 3 ways for providing workforce housing. And so this payment in lieu of only applies to the GNOD and nowhere else in the city. So in that overlay district, you can build the workforce housing. There's a payment in lieu of option, and then there's a land transfer option. And So because there's a payment in lieu of option, we need to have that in the fee schedule for the city. So that's the reason for this recommendation and vote. So that's incorporated to that fee schedule in case there's a development within the GNOD that opts to do payment in lieu instead of one of the other two. It's not applicable to anywhere else in the city.
So it would only, if we took the GNOD and wanted to expand it to other parts of the city.
Then it would,
become more
correct.
relevant.
Right.
And if it's not applicable to anywhere in the city, I think we'd be setting precedent with this, wouldn't we?
Anywhere else.
Anywhere else, if it's
Yeah,
not
if you-
currently applicable anywhere else in the city and there currently they're not currently a payment in lieu in the GNOD. But just.
Oh,
in the-
right, but nowhere else, right?
Only-
right.
If we establish the process going forward for the GNOD, it would have a ripple effect through elsewhere in the city, wouldn't it? In the future, like if this was considered.
If we allowed it elsewhere.
You
Yeah, if
have
we
to
allowed
change
it
the
out-
zoning, but there's no, it wouldn't provide any push to change the zoning. It would just, it just is letting us have a vehicle. If that payment in lieu of is offered, we have a way to take the payment in lieu of. Whereas right now we don't. So that's the only thing it satisfies. It could be used if you guys decided maybe we should think about payment in lieu of and expanding, or if the council wanted to do that in the ordinance, they could do that.
But to,
That
If you do it-
this isn't arguing for that. I guess that was.
I think it's just in that one area, but I guess if I'm understanding the question correctly, doing it in that area doesn't set a precedent that impacts any other areas of the city.
Right. Right.
Mind you, the
Right.
GNOD was established in certain areas based on land size and opportunity there. And when we looked at the parcels that were to be considered, there was a pretty scrutinizing process to arrive at the pieces that have been placed in the GNOD. So a lot of those that I think you're getting at have almost been disqualified from being a certain size or capacity. Therefore, this payment in lieu of is not really economically viable for those pieces. At least preliminary. I have a separate but related question.
Okay. Go ahead.
In the policy consideration. Says, while the city generates revenues that can be eventually used to finance. Income controlled housing units, the actual delivery can be at a slower pace, given the time intensive process tied to new development. More of a general inquiry, has the city ever financed development projects on their own behalf or in a P3 style development?
Wasn't it, what is it called?
recently.
CIP funds that were given to.
Those are capital improvement things. So that's like infrastructure.
Could that
kite
not
items.
be something?
It's
that
not
the
financing.
trustees Could contribute to instead of a.
So we're thinking of like this housing trust.
Yep.
Could possibly be a vehicle to do some grants or I don't like to call it lending because it's really, we're bringing the money in to grant it out to be able to create more low income housing, workforce housing, affordable housing, however you want to call it. So I don't see this as we're lending out money. We're creating a trust that will hopefully keep generating through fees like this
Yeah.
and donations, generating more housing based off of the trust and how it's written in the terms.
So in that fact, it's more of a reactive trust that accrues money and then upon applications or projects, people come to us and then when we go to issue that, let's say we want to issue it to a income controlled housing unit project, is that through an RFP because it's now issuing public funds?
No, because it's in a trust fund and it's based off of the trust that we're going to review at our next meeting.
Sure.
So
So
it's going to be based off of the purpose of the trust and the terms of the trust.
So that. For example, let's say there was a nonprofit in town that was land rich and cash poor. And wanted to sell off some of their land. We could use the housing trust fund to buy an acre of land, 2 acres of land and
Then it'd be an
And then-
RFP.
an RFP process for
Yeah.
a below market developer like the PHA.
Other than land, is there another use there? This is honest. like-
You could do it,
Yeah.
like if there was a project that needed to move forward but didn't have water and sewer connected to it, you could use that money.
Yeah.
to provide infrastructure to get that built.
Just have to be within the terms
As
of the
long as you
trust.
could, yeah.
And the hope, obviously, for everyone in the room and everyone in the community is that Portsmouth moves generally at a routine basis toward more affordable housing units. Great. With this structure, it seems as though, again, it's very reactive, where yes, we are accruing funds, which is great, but not on any sort of agenda, waiting for people to ask us for that money, which I get is how a trust works, but is there an ability to say, hey, this trust is driven towards X amount of units or connecting X amount of projects to funds that they would otherwise not have the access to?
Once again, I'll go look at the language of the trust, and it's going to be when we review that, that's going to give the terms, and how, you don't want to make it so narrow that it, you know, because you're, right, you don't make it so narrow that it doesn't get used, you also don't want to make it so broad that nobody wants to give money to it.
And
So
that's-
it's a fine line when you are drafting a trust for a specific purpose.
Entirely. My question is more on the timing of that. So,
But we need the trust done first, we need money in it, then we can figure everything else out.
okay, so I'm just one chapter.
I
ahead.
think you're, yeah, we gotta actually have the trust finalized and some money in it, and I would then start to worry about the rest.
I think Councilor Rose, got the sequence of tasks right, but what you're raising is, you know, if there was funding that people could apply for, you might have a quicker uptake. But I think we need to know our priorities. What do we consider our most important ways that these dollars can leverage into below market housing, and then the hierarchy of things that we want to do. Byron?
Yeah, so I think what Andrew was talking about earlier relative to the rules and looking at, I guess, the Dover's impact fee rules, that, yeah. I think that doesn't go so far as to like have a queue of folks looking for things, but I think it does set some framework ahead, and like maybe that is prudent before you start taking those in lieu payments. Because at least it provides some like initial guidance there. So that seems like maybe sequencing, that might be a good idea. And then just a general question on the in lieu policy. Does the city, if this is established, can they deny? Is it a by right situation where the developer can always just do in lieu, or is it a situation where the city can say, in this particular scenario, we don't think in lieu is prudent, and we are going to require the 10% workforce?
They have to follow them, right, the
Yeah.
way it was written.
In the GNOT, the zoning is clear on what they have to do.
Right.
Yeah.
If you donate, you build it yourself, or you do a payment.
Right.
And again, this is just right now for the GNOT. So the task before us is, you know, written into the GNOT is payment in lieu. How do we want it to function? Do we want, what's the calculation method that we're using? And that was-
With the amount.
Yeah,
per year.
is staff able to, or maybe you want to, John, explain a little bit more about how RKG was calculating it?
Related to RPG, is there a, the set aside parameter, is there a set aside parameter that impacts this? Cause I know the 10% set aside it's like 10% set aside for affordable units. Does that percentage have any impact on this payment?
Yes, because we're doing this per unit, so it's gotta be the percentage of units per unit, this would be the cost,
So
right?
we're voting on, or the recommendation is based on if we would accept a payment in lieu, but,
It's
or
the-
with the calculation, but was there an established, percent set aside?
It's already in the GNOT.
Yeah, it's 10, it's GNOT.
So you want to build 100 units?
No, I know what it means. I just wasn't sure because RKG, the difference between 10 and 15% was quite minimal. So, and I
Mhm.
should have read the whole GNOT, but yeah,
Mhm.
thank you.
Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Eric has a question.
Yeah.
I know we're engaged in this conversation now, but I mean, you know, with regards to the comments from patron. Is there any, would it require any recommendation for the data that she's analyzed to be done by staff to make comparison? I think she presented some, you know, insightful, you know, information that she's done on her own, but I would wonder, it would be recommendation this committee is to, you know, coincide anything that the staff can do to to verify her statements.
How do others?
From a data perspective,
Right.
she said 96% is.
I think the hard thing about those percentages, and they're probably right, but there's been so much change, particularly in the last 12 months around requirements with zoning, and these projects take so long to develop. You know, if you bought land in 2017 and you started the permitting process, you might not be under construction yet. But you're still working off of the rules from
Rules of that.
2017, not the change that happened this past summer. So there's definitely a lag effect.
Yes.
Well, I think she presented some insightful information that at least ought to, you know, have some verification to staff or something that would come back to us as a committee so that we could, you know, look at what this stuff is lining up to be.
I think it used to be the planning department kept a spreadsheet of all the future projects and the
Yeah.
units numbers.
Yeah, so that we can provide data, we can, you know, verify data that was provided. The challenge is, what are we looking at? Are we looking at approved units? Are we looking at units in development, units that are on their way to development? I mean, there's so many different variables. So if we look at just approved units over a certain amount of time, we could do that. But every day the data is changing because an approval might have gotten approved 2 years ago and they haven't done anything to get their project going. But they want to, they're trying to, but they haven't gotten there. So there's a lot of not gray, but different ways to parse the data. So what we could provide, maybe what would be better is what John's talking about, just a spreadsheet of what's been developed and how many units, and then maybe where
Just-
they are in the
Yeah,
process.
status.
Rather than try to say what percentage is developed as workforce, and you can do your own math on that, that's fine. But it comes down to the status, and that's ever changing.
You're also-
I would think something that would be helpful is, this committee's now almost a year old. And we had that goal set to know how many units got permitted during our first year. And then we could keep updating that like quarterly so that we would know where the status of units that are getting permitted based off of maybe some changes, so that we really see the effect of what we've been doing and working on. I think that would be helpful.
If you want that data to be more pertinent, because they are lagging indicators and most of those projects in the zoning that they sit, the zoning has already changed. I think the more relevant information would be how many of the units sit in the GNOD now, how many would have been
Zero.
impacted or impacted.
It's easy now, zero.
Yeah, giving you an example, but my point being, Eric, is all of those developments are lagging indicators. We can use almost zero of that data as relevant changes to the zoning here. Now, we can show that historically speaking, developers are not raising their hand to create low-income housing or income-controlled housing. So if the data is important to you, yes, but where in the city now are projects happening that otherwise would have been impacted? So that I think is more important.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think, if the implication is, there hasn't been enough, a successful construction of these units, I don't know if I follow the argument that, trying to encourage more of them or getting new payments somehow, is contrary to that goal. So, yeah.
Well,
Can I just add that the HOP2 grant is really looking at that, is why haven't we succeeded in getting more workforce housing? How do we change the zoning to get more workforce housing? So your support of that is important, and that's what the HOP2 grant's intended to do. So that, looking at zoning more in depth and trying to, you know, encourage or not quite require, but as close as we can get to requiring workforce housing.
We set our goals early on in what we wanted to see for this type of, you know, this type of effort.
Yeah.
It would be just insightful to see if we're even approaching that, we're just paddling, you know, we're just, you know, struggling in the tide here. And I think it would be just some information that gives us some direction of where we still want to keep heading. We established it, we established our goal. I want to see, I think it would be helpful to know if we're even going to possibly achieve it.
what gets measured gets managed.
Yeah.
So if that's the sense of the committee, that we would like an update on.
Well, I would just say, I think, what recommendations has this committee made other than the Sherborne property that would have affected, like
Gina,
you know,
but
and
it's,
how long?
it's
does it
very
take?
new.
Yeah.
It's, yeah, we passed it in December.
I
Was it? No,
Yeah,
November, I
right.
take that back,
November.
November.
I mean,
My months are all
I
running
agree
together.
with you. I agree with you. I think we should be measuring the effectiveness of the changes. I just don't know if, 60 days is, like enough of a sample size. Relative to, as far as like, I guess to your point about, is the committee making changes that are like having an effect? I think that was the intent of your statement.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if what the output of the committee relative to the changes is 60 days old. I don't know if we're in a, I don't know if there's
Too
been
soon
enough
to
of
know.
a cadence to know the answer to that question.
Whatever timeline is necessary to take some type of measurement. it's appropriate, but, whether it's 60 days, whatever, but just as long as we know that we're still, all the other ingredients that have been described here, the zoning changes and, the variables that are in this whole process is, I don't know if it's kind of frustrating to you to know that, you set your goal and you're just not gonna get there because you're gonna have to go through. You're not gonna get in it, you're not gonna travel in a direct line. You're gonna meander through a bunch of variables that can affect things, so.
That's Portsmouth zoning
Yeah.
and that.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
without getting
Tracy.
into
Yes.
specifics, just as the first meeting of the year, I think it would be great to maybe review our goals. See where we are on that agenda of goals. What are we gonna try to knock out this year? What's left for the following year? Just sort of that simple, high level. Here we are. Not that we're looking for specific percentages, number of units and how much money are we gonna have? Just in general, what are we gonna try to do this year? Yeah.
Do we need a motion?
We do.
We do. Okay.
I can make a motion to vote to recommend the city council adopt a payment in lieu of fee using the construction cost calculation method, which is purchase price of a market rate unit minus the purchase price of an income controlled unit as outlined in the RKG report.
Second. Okay. Any more discussion?
I don't know what that means.
Okay. So it means you take the market rate price of a unit.
So you're buying any unit in the city that is market rate.
No, it has to be that specific
Yeah,
development, right?
yeah.
What is the cost at the market rate cost?
So in the GNOD, there's none.
Correct.
And that developer is going to develop housing, and so it's the cost to build a unit?
It's the construction cost calculation, right? So it is the
You say
construction.
right, like that's a very simple thing, but it's not.
Well, it's not, I get it's not simple, but that's what, in order for them, we put it, the onus on the applicant, right?
They have
Correct.
To be
bring
able to show us the numbers,
information on cost.
right?
So it's the difference in the cost for the developer to build a market rate unit and the cost for that developer to build a
Income
income restricted unit.
In theory, aren't those the same?
controlled unit.
That's my point.
So that physically, yeah,
Isn't there a stipulation that they have to be the same?
Not necessarily.
but if they were in the same building.
If they're in the same building, if they're in the same project, no?
They might not use the same materials. It may not, you may
No,
not
you
have.
to use the same material. If you are West End Yards property, the West End Yards property, those units are exactly the same. You do not know if your neighbor is on income controlled housing.
The purchase price.
That's why. I think
Whoa, it's the purchase price
Yeah.
and not the construction cost. So why do they call it construction cost?
Clearly outlines it there.
Yeah.
Well,
And I'm not attacking you, Beth. It's
No, this is the way I read what they wrote.
that's what it is. What they wrote. That is, it is
Cost.
hopefully incorrect because you don't go into a project assuming that your land acquisition cost is gonna be lower for an income controlled unit.
won't be.
This is, yeah.
Yeah, and the recommendation here is RKG recommends the construction cost valuation approach for payment in lieu. So I'm not clear on where the market
Explain.
price comes into play at all.
And then,
But
and
they
again,
clearly say right here.
It's a price.
Right.
Right, price.
Market rate price over the.
And
Oh, so basically it's the market rate price less the HUD price of what the HUD level price would be for.
now,
So if the market could get 600, but they could only get 400, it would be a 200.
and
In simple
Where are you
numbers.
starting?
do you read this definition?
Well, no, I don't, but it says in the first paragraph, though, it says it's an or, right? So it's a value gap calculation or a construction cost calculation. It seems like if you were a developer, you would just offer the construction cost calculator, because the answer would be 0.
That was my point. So, and the same applies to the assessment, right? So in the last paragraph, RKG Associates recommends using the value gap calculation as it reflects the fairest assessment from a financial feasibility perspective. So if you're a developer, you are going to be extremely conservative on what your market rate unit is going to sell, rent, or trade for. To Eric's point about how we can't really assess our goals, it is an imperfect science. So if you are doing your feasibility study on a new development, whether it's in the GNOD or in the middle of downtown, it doesn't matter. You are going to be conservative on both applications. And so you would never be able to dispute it as a city if a developer came in and said, we're going to sell this one for 200 and this one for 100. And then later on, you realize that they sell the market rate for 300. So
But
that
I
to me,
think the difference is that your market, you're saying you're gonna sell it for this amount as a developer. And
would
we take
never
that
sell it.
information and then we take the HUD value of what an income controlled unit would sell for
The
and
developer will
that
never-
percentage difference.
has the developer ever walked into their application?
It's not looking at the cost of construction, it's looking at the percent difference.
In what?
Can we figure out how other towns do this? Because we're not the first group to try to invent something. Like, every
Other
city-
towns were all over the place, like Kittery charges $100,000 for payment in lieu of.
I think that the
Yeah.
answer to this is a developer has never walked into an application and said, this is how much I'm charging for my market rate units. And we owe, it is by and large, someone on the planning board or zoning board asks that question. And then they always say, we haven't quite determined it yet. And so when do you apply that? When it hits the market on Zillow? I think that's entirely
I
too
think
late.
it can be verified, they're gonna have the cost of the sale price.
Right, but that's.
So they can't
after
say,
the
they
fact-
can't make it up.
That's an after the fact thing.
Right,
you're
so
gonna
that's-
Chase them down for the money that.
Well, when are they gonna sell? When they sell it, that's when they have to pay into the in lieu of.
Okay, I think that's certainly not acknowledged in this policy.
Well, this is just setting up
This
the
is just setting
process.
the process.
It's not going through a scenario of each project. So
Right, so this is essentially adopting what the consultant has recommended.
I don't think we can do that until we understand.
Yeah,
It's way
I think there's
too-
that's a giant chunk of information that we all had to talk through to get to. Like, to me,
This
that
one?
should be
No,
pretty much
that-
spelled out.
Value that, what's,
Yeah.
can
This
someone
one
very,
is like,
yeah.
it's in a rental unit. So if you're,
Based off
if
rental.
you're anticipating that you're going to get $200 a year at the bottom line from a market rate unit and only $100 a year from an income restricted
oh,
unit.
yeah,
Then you divide it by a cap rate, which sets the value of those annual payments over time.
okay.
And kind of baked into all of this, not to belabor the point, and I apologize for getting excited. Having just recently sold a 4-unit building in Somersworth that had all income controlled units, Section 8 vouchers. Half of the investors that looked at that building said, great, we love guaranteed income. The other half said, no way. So if you're dividing by a cap rate, which is the market's determination of what that is worth, that is also an arbitrary amount. So if this developer sells this project, whether it sells the permits or sells the actual building, you have to consider what that determination or difference in value might be based on who you are selling it to.
But that's part of like, it's an art, not a science. So you're
Sure.
never gonna be down to the penny.
But they use cap rate.
What I think is really right, they do. And maybe the city has to set a cap rate or something, but like, this is so fuzzy on what they even mean that I don't feel comfortable voting on it.
I think we're getting a road test of
Okay.
this from developers in our room right now.
Yeah, I know.
Yes. If I make a motion to table, will the staff have an opportunity to address the concerns that were raised today,
For the next meeting?
the next meeting?
Sure.
Isn't RKG going to be at the next meeting?
Well,
No.
Oh,
we don't know for sure.
Are
Okay,
we
so-
okay on time?
I mean,
In
as
terms of,
opposed
It's
to.
6:20 right now.
Feeding this thing, I'll make a motion to table.
Second.
before we go to a vote, Is there any deadline for this action?
No, I mean, there's no pending,
We'll need to come up with it, but I don't, think that
Right.
should be fine. And it's
All right.
better that you understand it and it's clear,
Right.
so.
there's no deadline.
Okay, so, that, yes.
It does talk about in here how there's a chart at the end of the report. Could you maybe bring
Mhm.
back that chart as well so that we can see that chart with it? That would be helpful. Because otherwise I have to go dig and find it and that might take me an hour. The
Right.
report's really long.
But that RKT report is on the housing website.
It is. Oh, no, I have a copy of it. That's not the problem.
although you're-
Finding what I want.
Byron had his hand up.
So I just, so as part of the vote that we're making. Potentially, I know we're tabling or potentially tabling, but the vote that we'd be making, there's a recommendation that the city council not adopt this policy specifically as it's written, right? But a payment in lieu of fee and then assumedly working with planning and the council actually like do the work of writing that policy. So I think it would be, and so these policy recommendations and our recommendation that we're just gonna go in this direction. I think coming back from, I think it would be nice to have at least a draft or something more specific as to what the actual city policy would be. And some of those specifics of what Andrew's referring to in terms of the sequence at which or when these things happen, I think is important to understand like how the mechanic might work.
And I really would love to see how other towns do.
Does Nashville allow payment?
That being, there's no more comment, we'll vote to table. Oh, question. Yes,
I
call.
have just, is it clear for you, like, what our questions are and what the view, okay, just in case.
Yep,
'cause we
clear
don't
enough.
know.
So, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Next month. But thank you for those of you with the actual hands-on development experience. Eating this up a little.
So
Really good in the long run.
even though said and just like, I am not even on the JV team of development in this town, and luckily there are a lot of them in this town, so maybe we just give them a shout, or invite them to the next meeting, and like, have that kind of conversation.
I bet Eric Chinberg would be happy to
And-
give
and
his experience in that.
Most of them have done work in other municipalities that probably have something of that variation. So that to me is worth its weight in gold to then have that translated into how it applies to Portland.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thank you. On to our next item, which is city-owned properties. When Peter Stith told me that we did not have the housing trust fund document done, I said, well, let's go back to the city-owned property. Because that is an area that we as the city have total control. We're not changing zoning necessarily. And we've all invested the time in site walks. So I would put it to the committee this way. We reviewed these 4 parcels, we walked them. How do we get these into disposition for housing, if that's what we want to do? And I'll take open that discussion.
Do we have? I would look to start it, is there any one piece that has a possibility of a priority? Good question. And if it is, then how do we proceed? Do we proceed under the same process that we just concluded with Sherman School? In, into developing that into something that's a little bit more concrete.
Ultimately,
We've looked at all the properties, we've seen their assets and other possibilities, but now is it time to prioritize? Is it time to prioritize it here? And then the process to move it on into development.
I think wasn't there a rating process?
Yeah. It would be.
There's been a number of efforts. I guess to your point, I don't think that you guys have looked at all the properties, is my understanding.
We've looked at the 4 that are included in the packet.
Right, all those properties, but there's a lot more properties to see. So I don't know if that's the,
4 more. or three more that were.
On the
viable,
finalized list.
And one of them was
But-
already in the Sherburne area.
I guess the only one that was on that list was probably 195 Greenleaf Ave.
That's his.
Former, right,
We can't do housing yet.
Correct.
this year.
right. It is, that's,
So-
I think that's the
Did we
only
get
one on
this?
the list he didn't. What?
Yeah, I think we heard it.
We had raised the question, and I know that I raised it at one of the meetings, I didn't know we get a response.
I don't think we have a formal response, but I think we have been told that because it was Coast Guard, it's limited to recreation.
Yeah, that was my.
Oh, Greenleaf,
my
yeah, that's
assumption.
right. The
It's
coast, it
limited
is, it
to-
is limited recreation through the Coast Guard.
That's what I
Yeah,
thought.
I didn't know you
Yeah.
were talking about that.
So who owns the property?
We
The
do,
city.
we
City
do
of-
with restrictions.
Right, one of our site walks, there were a lot of mention about the baseball field, near Atlantic Heights, also having restriction based on how that land is actually gifted to the city. Do we know if that is, that was coming from some community members who had,
Oh, I think that might be right too. but-
lived history or lived memory of that, and so is it possible to find out? So that we can either discredit that as an option,
Was that on the highway?
sometime between 1917 and now, I would assume.
Another way we do this would be, I mean, it's a mixed bag, right? Some are have various characteristics. If the council, if we recommended that the council ask for a report back on what could be done with each of these four in terms of housing,
Would the report come
from staff,
from? Okay.
that, I'm just putting that out there. But I want to hear from staff first.
Well, that's pretty broad, I guess. We certainly could look at them from a deed restriction standpoint, and say, is there any reason they couldn't be developed? From a deed standpoint,
Right, because you're not gonna go through the process of saying,
but the
yes,
type
we
of,
can do so many units on this place, and you're not gonna do that.
right, that's what I'm getting at, is that we wouldn't know if it'd be a couple of houses or a multifamily building or what in the end, but the bigger question is there a deed restriction on it? Is there reasons why it couldn't be developed? Is there some other use intended by the city? We could look into that.
I mean, we've already talked about two properties that have deed restrictions, or possibly deed restrictions. We've got Granite Street, which is already a softball field, so even though Joe doesn't like me asking the question about whether or not the developer has to pay to build another softball field, that would be a question on that one. So, I mean, so there are some issues that you can address at that level.
Would it be possible for us to prioritize within ourselves?
Sure.
The land, because I feel strongly, I would say that we would.
Tell us.
Yeah, I would prioritize first, thinking overall about the history of these neighborhoods and how they were built, so I would, move away from initially prioritizing Atlantic Heights, due to its history of being, one of the more affordable places, but thinking about not concentrating, workforce and affordability in just specific areas, so to that end, I would look to the Lower City lot as my first priority. And then the second priority I would do is 25 Granite due to the expansive area there. That is a former school area. It makes sense, I think, also to reconsider what was already a public good. As well, I think you can find new places for softball fields much easier than we can find affordable units in the city. That's also for this one, it's also walking distance to groceries, which I think is a very important element if you're also thinking about like a population that might only have one car for a family of four or that. So there's a lot of other benefits there. So for that, I would prioritize those two.
That sounds like, same argument for Commerce Way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, Commerce Way is right. across the
It's right across the street,
street.
so it's the same argument.
Hopefully more.
I'm a lot of things, but I'm not a softball player. Does that field get used?
Yeah.
routinely?
Yeah.
Yeah, it gets used a lot.
And
By the city, by other teams?
Yeah.
Like,
All of the above.
Does it-
that softball field is the one that used to be next to the middle school.
Yeah.
And when we built the library, they rebuilt it up there,
Mm.
and it gets a significant amount of use.
And then I was saying I was a softball coach for 2 years with my daughter, and there was always a lack of softball fields.
Yeah.
And is Tony Ron Field still?
Yeah, the problem with these fields is they flood, particularly bad. And then the other one is at Shearborn, like, so I think there's, yeah, I mean, that, yeah, that, could- yeah.
Can a baseball field be converted to a softball field?
They're building one out, a softball field out at, community
Community
campus.
campus is gonna have it, so.
Point is, you know, land is land, whether it's a softball field or housing, but I mean, there isn't a lot of land left in Portsmouth to say, all right, let's put housing where that softball field is and go find another piece for, you know, replace it. It just isn't a problem.
Well, you know, what you do have is that, and I've been involved with this in a couple of different places, but without saying it, I can say, you know, there are places within the community that would be welcoming to softball fields that are not necessarily city-owned property.
Sure. But I mean, I think, I mean, like at Hislop, there's a baseball field now, it's like if the softball field comes away from Granite, I think there's an opportunity at Hislop in terms of expanding the recreation there. And then what I liked about Granite, was, and I don't know, this would be interesting to get feedback from the staff, we talked about. There's the condo association kind of back in that corner, there's an opportunity to maybe somehow combine land there. So I'd be interested to know how.
Isn't this wet? Is this wet?
But
There's wetlands right
there's a
here.
corner down farther over that's not wet.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
that's owned by the condo association, but not management to it, if I remember
Correct.
right.
So the other point on that is that it's not necessarily mutually exclusive that the softball field goes away.
Right, you
There
could,
might be room to put housing on the lot as it is without even expanding the lot.
Right.
Just depends on how many units you want to get and how big it is, so.
And that would create-
You could create a little nice little community back there if you had.
oh, Jay,
Thanks, somebody.
Thanks.
Yeah, I forgot to put my hand down, but Byron just,
Hang on.
Can't hear you.
I can hear him.
can you hear me?
Try now.
Hello,
Oh, there you go.
everyone? Hello?
Yes, we got you.
I'm tuning in. Yeah, my hand was up but Byron cut me off at the feet there and mentioned the same thing that I was going to mention, which is that there had been discussion about potentially acquiring the land adjacent to 25 Granite Street in order to expand that property. And I think the wetlands were one of the reasons we felt it might be viable, because they kind of blocked off any potential for the condo association to expand, and that corner that Beth was discussing, it's basically cut off like an island. So if we could acquire that, you know, with money potentially from a trust through payment in lieu payments, that could be a much larger parcel.
Nice.
That's way down the way.
But that's something you could use the housing trust money for. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I thought Mary's analysis was pretty good. How do you guys feel about that ranking?
I would also like to know if 134 Preble is indeed deed restricted, just so that we could even not think about it if we know that. It'd just be nice to know, for sure.
I have a pretty dumb question. We have a landfill.
Mm-hmm.
Can you do anything with that?
Solar panels?
That's, we're looking at putting solar
You
panel.
can't put.
Maybe. It's time
It's
to
just,
out.
yeah,
Yeah, dumb question.
In my, I also have
I
the
don't
energy committee hat. And the state DES has not liked the idea of recreation on top of that.
Yeah, just as I look at it.
It's a lawsuit
Yeah,
waiting to
From a
happen.
housing standpoint, it'd be really challenging.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Solar panels, though?
But if you're not like tapping into the water source. But.
Yes.
Yeah, so, Eric?
Oh, for a ball field.
No,
Oh,
okay,
sorry.
finish that.
Okay.
Just want to add another question. Opposite the deed restriction of the- Can that be removed? Does Coast Guard have any vested interest in that, and just to have them sign off and turn that back to the city and, you know, the
It-
prospect?
We could always ask, but I highly doubt it.
It depends, you know, why would, because they gave it to the city for, they have a program in place that provides property for recreation uses, and that's where that went through.
Or think of the senior center, right? We acquired that property for a specific purpose and it's restricted to that purpose. That is what happens whenever the government is giving you property. It always comes with a lot of tight strings.
Right, but in this particular case, if they look at it, in the fact that it has a potential other public benefit, which is housing. Identified as, you know, some of the priorities, would they have the, would they entertain of?
If we could find the right.
If you don't have to, you don't know.
I don't know. We'd have to ask, and it would be a long road to get there, would be, because you'd have to find the right person and you'd have to find the right mechanism. And knowing how slow government works, it's gonna be a 5-year project just to get that answer.
So,
5 years from now, nothing that we do now probably is gonna have a, you know, completely solved at the end of 5 years. So it's not bad to ask a question, or at least search out where the question should be asked to find out what the perspective, you know, use of that property is. It's a terrific piece of property, used for something. And I'm not saying it's not being used in a
Only about half of it's
application
really being used.
already now, but it might have a better use.
so Mary has said our top priority would be the City Hall lower lot, followed by Granite Street. And we want, I'm hearing that that's what Mary has said to us. And we want to learn about these deed restrictions. So is there a recommendation to the council that we might make that would wrap all that together?
I think we've asked for questions back from staff first, right? So do we need that report back before we finalize that?
Okay, so if we had the deed information come back to our February.
We can do that.
I'd also be interested in having a broader conversation about. About the process, that if we do recommend a parcel, what is the process for? From that point forward. I have some feelings.
Could we consider
Maybe we
that
could do
for
it
the
better.
for the next session as well, so that we can maybe finalize that earlier than later, so that we also don't slow down. with it.
Yes. In other words, a sample motion next week, assuming we have a report.
Or the discussion about the process could happen whether or not we have the report back. Because whether it's one of these parcels or a parcel on the GNOD. The expectation is that this process will have to happen again.
Right.
And I think there are ways that we could do it better.
We should have, that's a good discussion. So let's mark that for the agenda for next time.
Do you want to get on public comment?
Yeah.
Yes. Eric,
Public comments, I didn't want to interrupt the agenda as is, but I just do have one comment that, I framed after our last meeting. And I wrote that, it's the process that we concluded our recommendation on the Sherman School. So, and we went into that meeting with the fact that both developers and some assurance that we're going to have some dialogue with those developers. That changed minutes before the whole meeting started, and the whole structure of the meeting changed considerably, that we voted before we had any discussion. There were a lot of questions that were not answered through the city council process, just from a time perspective. But we hope some of those issues could be cleared up in a conversation with the developers. It did not take place. And I found that to be concerned. And I didn't want to, you know, I think wherever we go in the future, we should not let that, you know, if we're going to do the same type of thing, we should not let that happen again. I don't think it was, you know, I don't think it benefited our process, or maybe even our decision on the vote. The second thing is, And it's all hindsight, it's all over the dam, and it's well down the river, all right? But, we went out with an RFP to each developer to give us 2 proposals, one with the school and one without the school. And we never made a decision, this, in this committee, to make a recommendation over which one of those 2 proposals did the committee have a preference to. We just really focused our preference on the developer and not each developer submitted 2 proposals. One with, one without. And so that I felt did not complete our process or our responsibility to at least make a recommendation. Wherever it's gonna go after that, it was out of our hands because we made a recommendation. So those are the 2 points. I wrote my concerns about that after the meeting. I never got a response, but I'm just bringing them up here for at least me spouting off again to say that I would hope it would not, wherever we go in the future, it would not happen like that.
Right, and I did call you.
Right. I don't know if anybody else had any concern about that. It was something that I remember quite clearly last.
Well, and I'm glad you brought forward your concerns. And the point is that we should have clear rules for asking questions and making time to ask questions.
And I think we tailored that decision to have that conversation with the developers over some particular, circumstances that changed the agenda before anybody even knew it's going to change. Until we arrived at the meeting and said, no, we're not going to entertain that, but I thought that was an important component of that meeting. And it did not take place because of some specifics surrounding.
Do others want to discuss that?
If nobody else has any concern, I've expressed my concern, and that's it. I just didn't want to go, have it go forward without at least some comment.
I'm glad you brought it forward. Public comment? Hands up for those who want.
Yeah, can I start? So first of all, you guys have meeting agendas, and really, I hope you would consider going back to 2 meetings a month. Considering the kind of, sorry volunteers, but because we're pinched, right? We have people that want to say things here, and we're already run out of time, basically. So that would be my first suggestion. I just wanted to give you a perspective from the housing advocate, reflect back to you, the committee, the perspective of housing advocates. So the good news is there's a small army of people working out there on housing organizations. I send out a newsletter to over 220 residents now who are particularly interested in following housing issues. And the other good thing about the army of people working this is a lot of young people, right? And young people have a lot more at stake in this housing thing than we do. I'm looking at the 2 gray hairs and me over here. This is not about hopeless. It's about Portsmouth in the future. It's about Portsmouth 10, 15, 20 years from now. So it's very important for young people to see encouragement and to believe in local government that it works for. So I would like to be able to send out in my newsletter something that shows that Portsmouth had its head around the housing issues, all the different components of it, not necessarily solutions, but just that you understand the whole thing. And I'm not able to do that. I curate all kinds of information about meetings, but housing relevant meetings, media posts, all that stuff, but I cannot really show people. So, so what would a city response look like? Well, like I said, it doesn't have to be the solutions, but we need something that's a quick, easy to grasp, big picture presentation. And I think this committee is probably the best place for it to come from. Graphic, and you guys could have your stamp on it. I'll give you an example of the kind of thing that we're looking for. Right? In a few minutes, there's a planning board meeting. One of the things that we discussed there, Beth and Tracy, for 2 years, is project that could end up with 82 individual units, right? This is workforce housing, it's private development, and it's going through the quasi-judicial process right now. But we're talking about the possibility of having 82 independent units downtown in pods with shared facilities. It's a unique proposal. The chair of the planning board has voiced support for it. It would depend partly on the CUP being granted parking. But that is like, we don't know as advocates whether this is even on your radar, right? Whether it's on the city's radar, whether it's important to you, and where it fits in the big picture. It does fit in, right? So that's kind of one of the things we're looking for, is something that shows us that you understand the big picture, but all these parts and the projects like the one I was talking about fit here, right? Or something fits here. So it's a big deal, this new type of housing, co-living. And so, as I said, I think we need to be getting some kind of feedback from you that that's recognized as being important. And that maybe you can do something in the future. I met with the mayor yesterday. We talked about a lot of this stuff, and he's, we talked about the reality of the housing issues, and he agreed at the end of the conversation that there does need to be something that I'm talking about here, that kind of reassures the general public and especially advocates that the big picture is being addressed. And I think that there's the real planning will get done probably in the master plan this year, and that will be tackling specific goals, strategies, zoning, and so on. But there needs to be an interim step where the city can show that it's kind of got its head around this bigger picture. And one of the things that I would propose to this committee is that there's a work session. You can bring some people in and sit with you and say, look, this is what it might look like. And it could include the kind of data that Petra and Eric were talking about earlier, which is something I've been advocating for a year, which is kind of a graphic of that moving line. It changes daily. We know that projects that are in the permitting cycle, projects in the pipeline, under construction, and so on, and where those numbers are going. Because then against that, the city has to be able to show, well, where, that's going on, and some people are angry about it, and about the market rate housing that's going on. But the city's doing this. We have these projects going, and maybe we can do 15, 18 suites a year, and maybe we can do this and that. But at least then we see that, yeah, okay, that's part of the total housing picture. So that's what advocates are looking for, and really appreciate. I know I'm critical of the committee sometimes, but really appreciate the work. It's difficult work. It's a complex situation. The final thought is Joanne at some point mentioned the importance of looking at things that fail. I know of two really good projects that both failed in zoning board adjustments the last couple of years, and it'd be really good to have that discussed and for learning to be taken. Is there something that can be done in the future during these land use committee meetings that will be less likely to produce that result, where there's leeway with committee members, board members, and they can go one way or the other, right? And why don't they pick the housing option if they can? So I realize I'm going to time. Sorry, guys. But that was it. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jerry. And thanks for all you're doing to advocate.
We're working hard every day, right?
So last year we talked about that funnel. You have I mentioned at the time, it's proposed to start with what's proposed, because that's actually your gross units. And to Jerry's point, some of those get rejected somewhere down the line. And you need to understand that feedback from the vision can provide you with critical information. You can't just look at what is built. You need to look at what's not built. you know, we have branch examined zoning, why not getting workforce housing? Complexity is continually. It's time and delays cost money. Cost money. We need to understand the capacity of the city services and how X units, Y residents, an increase in X units, Y. Affects the school, police, fire, public works, water treatment facilities. Opposition to housing is in part driven by an ever-increasing budget. Knowing how development affects the budget is critical. This can be quantified, should be quantified. That's true whether oppose or support development. I guess the question is, how do we get that information? You know, the department has provided. You know, are we at 90% capacity with the water facilities, or are we at 50 or 40? You know, the 100 units going to push us over the property. Where is it? We don't. How can we say we want more development? We don't even know what causing development. Workforce housing. Workforce housing is between, say, 10 and 20% of units required in the development subsidy incentive. So 80% of the units are going to be market rate. That's a 4-to-1 ratio of market rate to workforce. Workforce housing is dependent upon market rate housing being built. Workforce housing isn't scaling because of that dependency. Solve with the supply of market rate housing, or solve with that has to be. It can't be backwards. A number of proposals will reject the incentive for workforce housing. The incentive is actually a cost. Cost that burdens the project further, reducing the likelihood that workforce is going to be built. The incentive, called a density bonus, is a cost burden similar to mandatory parking requirements. How many of you want mandatory parking requirements? We know that it drives up costs and it doesn't. It starts someone with great. If you want more workforce housing, set the cost burden as low as possible, preferably to zero. If you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. The history of incentives to provide affordable housing has had limited success. This has been known for decades. If you keep trying to micromanage it and change the dial a little bit, you're still playing with the same tool. You've got to rethink how this is going to work from an economic perspective. Ultimately, it's only going to be built if it's economically feasible. And the market's better at that than I am, than anybody in this room. No one here has the skill set, not even me. I'd like to suggest a flash survey that captures the trade-offs of density of development. Offered tonight's the approval of McNabb JJ Woodbury property. This is an opportunity to provide much needed affordable housing, but look at the hoops and obstacles that prevent this. Delay this, drive up the cost. And I'm not sure how many times, you know, Tracy and McNabb have had to show up down here. Maybe they're working for free. I don't know. But that's time, money, and delay. Why is that a good thing? Look at these need to be simplified in regular policy. Thank you.
Okay. Andrea?
Quickly, I wanted to take a minute to thank, echo Jerry's comments, to thank you all for the work you've been doing. We've gotten to the point where we are, inviting the community to participate in the Sherburne School discussion, planning and design. And as a room that I consider, relatively experts, on this process, and certainly invested. We would love you all to come and participate if you're available. There's a little bit of information here, especially dates and locations, and a chance to RSVP. There will be more information sent out. And I just encourage you all to use the PHA as a resource as well to understand aspects and tools of development that you know, you talk about developers in the city, and as a developer in the city that specifically uses tools that successfully develop workforce housing, I'm sure that we would love to be a resource for you as well.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. And I know our planning board folks have to leave. Thank everybody.
We adjourn.
Move adjourned. All in favor?
Aye.
And I'm hearing for next meeting, goal setting for Tracy,